Good afternoon and welcome to Goizueta's GMAT prep test and seminar session. My name is Angela Bostic. I'm the Associate Dean of Marketing here at the Business School, and I'll be moderating the chat we have today. This is actually a new chat topic for us, and so we're excited to kind of take you guys along with us to learn about the GMAT and also kind of dive into the questions to figure out how to approach certain problems and prepare yourself for tackling the GMAT test as a whole. I am joined on today's chat with a very good friend and alum of Goizueta. This is Mrs. Stephanie Espy. Stephanie is an '08 alum of Goizueta Business School, a rock star on the GMAT and all things analytical, and the founder and executive director of Math SP, which is a tutoring company here in Atlanta that does tutoring for things like the GMAT, GRE, and other versions of tests. So Stephanie works with us regularly to get us, kind of up and ready and running for training. So we thought we'd have an online webinar version of this chat for those of you who are planning to take it for the first time, the GMAT, or possibly take the test again in preparation for applying to the program. So we hope that you'll join us today. A couple of housekeeping things before I let Stephanie introduce herself and get started. You should feel free to submit your questions at any point in time. The process will be that Stephanie will be talking through a problem on the screen, and she'll actually show you her work, so you'll be able to see how she answers the problem. But if you have questions, feel free to submit those questions directly to our chat window as you have them, and I will field them on air to Stephanie. The questions being fielded on air today will be about the GMAT questions Stephanie is presenting. So if you have admissions-related questions or programmatic questions, you can ask them, but I likely won't be able to field them on air. We'll be answering those via the chat window or behind the scenes where we have individuals waiting to help answer some of those questions. The last thing is, if you are unable to get your question asked directly on here, you'll be able to submit those questions later on and be able to show how your questions might be related to what Stephanie is talking about here or elsewhere. So I'll let Stephanie introduce herself and then we'll get started. Again, feel free to submit your questions as we go along, and hopefully this will be an informative session for us to all go through. So Stephanie?
Thank you, Angela. So again, my name is Stephanie Espy. I'm an alum of the Goizueta Business School, the full-time program. I finished here in 2008. And I'm here today to talk about the GMAT, everybody's most favorite part of the application process. Hopefully today you'll learn a lot of different tips and strategies to help you get started with your GMAT prep. If you haven't gotten started already, and if you've taken the test once or twice before, again, still hopefully you should be able to take some things away from today's conversation. Please do submit your questions as I move along. I'm happy to answer your questions regarding these problems, and maybe you have worked them before. They all come from this lovely, lovely blue book. The official guide for GMAT Review 13th edition is the book I'm pulling questions from today. And on the slides, you'll see the problem as well as the question number. So if you have this book in front of you, you can certainly follow along. And if you don't have the book in front of you, you can purchase it later and then refer back to our the talk today to get some additional support around the questions we're going to discuss today. So to get started, our agenda for today is to give you a little bit of background information about the GMAT, and then we'll jump into the quantitative section. There's two different question types there. We'll first get into the problem-solving question types. I'll go through 5 different example problems from the official guidebook, and then we'll go through the data sufficiency part of the quantitative section. There's 5 questions there I'll also address before moving on to the GMAT verbal section. We'll go through some strategies for the 3 different question types in the verbal section. They include critical reasoning, sentence correction, and reading comprehension in that order. And then we'll wrap up with a study plan to help you sort of get started with your GMAT prep and figure out sort of what things you should be doing in order to be ready for this test when your test date comes along. So how does that sound?
Sounds good. Before we move on, I want to make sure that you note, I'm going to make sure Stephanie focuses the majority of her time on the questions at hand. So if we run long past the 1:30 time frame for this session, all of the slides in general, as well as the video itself, will be available to those of you who participated today after the chat within, probably 4 or 5 days. So the study plan detailed out in her slides will be something you can review later on. I want to make sure the content is stuff that Stephanie can present to you while she's here, because that's going to probably be the most valuable as you prep to go through taking the test. So we'll be mindful of keeping track of time so you guys don't feel like you miss anything. You will get the full video and the slides afterwards to be able to go through. But you can't ask your questions on the video after. So this is really valuable time for you to get your questions answered and to understand exactly how Stephanie is going through things. So with that said, I will go ahead and get us started on the About the GMAT section.
Perfect. So this slide just kind of gives you an overview of the GMAT. So this is, of course, the admissions exam for business school admissions, one of them. And there's 4 different content areas on the GMAT. There's the analytical writing section. and followed by integrated reasoning section. And then what we're going to talk about today are the last two sections, the quantitative section and the verbal section. So 4 different time sections on the GMAT for a total of 3 hours and 46 minutes, including 2 optional 8-minute breaks. So this test is computer adaptive, and what that means is that the questions that you see on the quant section and the verbal section adapt based on how you're answering the previous question. So it's not the kind of test that you may be familiar with, such as the SAT or the ACT or even the LSAT, where the questions are already preset and predetermined for you. On this test, the questions that you see do vary based on how you're answering the questions that you answered previously. So for example, question number 1 on the quant section is your 500 level question. That's your mid-range question. And if you get that question right, the next question you'll see will be slightly harder than the question before. And if you get it wrong, the next question you'll see will be slightly easier than the question before. And so that's how the test progresses until you get to the very final question. There are 37 quant questions in total on the GMAT, and there's 41 verbal questions in total. And the order that you see the question types vary. So the first question you see in the quantitative could be problem solving. The second question could be another problem solving. In fact, the first 10 could be problem solving before you get your first data sufficiency question. The same with the verbal section. You could have 3 or 4 critical reasoning questions back to back, or you could have it mixed up where you have critical reading, sentence correction, reading passages kind of all mixed in. So it's really no sort of structured sort of, this is what you have for every single test. Everyone taking this test is taking a different test with different questions in different ordering. So keep that in mind when you're in your test. The way this test is scored is as follows. The writing section is scored from 0 to 6. Integrated reasoning section is scored from 1 to 8. The quantitative section is scored from 0 to 60, as well as the verbal section scored from 0 to 60. But most of you are familiar with the 800 GMAT score, the score that you get that's out of 800. And just so you know, that 800 score is only combining 2 sections, the quantitative section and the verbal section. So though you get a separate scale score from 0 to 60, that is somehow put into a very proprietary algorithm that determines your overall GMAT score, which is out of 800. And so again, the 800 score just includes 2 sections. So your writing and your integrated reasoning scores are not a part of the 800 GMAT score, just those 2 sections. But really what's most important about your quant and your verbal scores is not the 0 to 60 score, but rather your percentile. Emory and other schools really want to know what percentile you scored in on the quant section, on the verbal section. So again, it's not so much that 0 to 60, but it's rather, are you scoring the 80th percentile, are you scoring the 70th percentile, etc., that they will look at to figure out how you're scoring relative to your peers at that given point in time. And the GMAT, of course, is like I said earlier, used for admissions, but also is used to determine scholarships. And also, once you finish your MBA, a lot of different companies, especially consulting companies, investment banking companies, ask for your GMAT scores when they make hiring decisions. So really keep that in mind as you start to plan and study for your GMAT. This test is really important for many different reasons, including post-MBA job opportunities. So I don't think a lot of people realize that when they take their GMAT, but there's lots of students who finish their MBA and end up taking the GMAT even after their MBA, or while they're in the MBA program, to get a higher GMAT score, so that when they're applying to different companies, they're presenting a higher score than maybe what the score they got into business school with.
Well, that's a good thing to note, as for all of you who are applying to programs who might have taken the test already and feel pretty good about your score. There's always value in being able to take that and score a higher score, not just with your admissions process, but the kind of roles you might be looking at. As Stephanie mentioned, finance and consulting tend to have requests about that. So you may have scored well enough for your program and still desire to distinguish yourself by taking that test again so that you have it. So in this case, that's where topics like Stephanie's really help, where she can give you an edge on how to answer those questions, so that possibly taking it again could have really great benefit for you.
Exactly. But ideally, you're taking this test just once or twice, maybe 3 times before applying to your business school programs. And then once you get your high score, you don't have to worry about taking it again during your program. So the best thing to do is to study hard for it now, so that you get the score you need to get. You get some, you get into your schools, you get some scholarships ideally, and also you get the score you need to get for post-MBA opportunities. Okay, so moving on to the next slide, we're going to get into the quantitative section now. And again, like I mentioned earlier, there's 2 different types of quant questions you're going to see. You're going to see some problem-solving questions. These we'll call PS questions. And these problems give you 5 answer choices, A, B, C, D, E, and they'll ask you to choose the correct answer. So this is what you're most likely used to from other exams you may have taken, before business school. Now, the unique question type to the GMAT is called data sufficiency. This is what we'll call DS. DS questions are asking you to answer a question based on given data. So you'll be given 2 different statements, statement 1 and statement 2, and based on those statements, your job is to determine, can I answer the question? So you're not actually going to answer the question. You want to know if you have enough information to answer the question. It's very, very important, as we'll see later, that you stop at the point where you have enough information. This is a time test, and you'll see at the last bullet point here, you have about 2 minutes per question on the quant section of this test. 37 questions, 75 minutes, so that's about 2 minutes per question on average. So there's not enough time to answer the question fully for the DS question type. So again, really, really important that you stop at the point where you have enough information versus answering and getting to a value that they don't really care about. And we'll talk more about that when we get to the DS sample questions. On the next slide, you'll see here a list of different concepts that are tested on the GMAT. So there's 3 different sort of categories of quantitative concepts. There's the arithmetic concepts here, including things like integers, even odd integers, prime numbers, percents, ratios, proportions, etc. So these are all things that if you haven't seen these things since you were a senior in high school or a freshman in college, you want to take some time to brush up on some of these fundamental concepts that are hugely important in doing well on the GMAT. Your algebra concepts, again, some of you may not have seen algebra since you were in high school, or maybe it's been a long time since you had to do things like factoring and foiling or absolute value, solve an equation with absolute value, or even something like a permutation or combination. So again, take some time to brush up on these fundamental concepts that you will see on the GMAT. Absolutely important that you do that before you sit for this GMAT. And then lastly, your geometry concepts. So all your formulas and rules for triangles, Pythagorean theorem, special right triangles, 30, 60, 90, 45, 45, 90, your area equations, your circumference equations, etc. These things will show up on the GMAT. So the worst that can happen is you're staring at a triangle problem on the GMAT and you can't remember the area for a triangle. Or you can't remember, how to calculate the hypotenuse of a triangle, etc. So you really need to brush up on these fundamental things that you're going to see on the GMAT, definitely before you decide to go and sit for the GMAT. So
let me pause for a second before you move on to this.
Sure.
I think a couple of you may be having some of the issues with what you're seeing on the screen. So if you're having any issues and you're behind, and what Stephanie is referencing is not showing up in your PowerPoint to the side of the screen, you can hit the button that you see and hide show video, and it'll refresh your feed. So since we're on, since this is being transmitted, you may have a low enough connection that it's not moving through quick enough. So just make sure you hit hide and show, and it should refresh your feed. She's actually currently on the slide that's mentioned GMAT quantitative concepts tested. So at the moment, when you're looking at that, you should see those slides. But again, she's going to write out each one of the portions. And so where you see Stephanie and I sitting right now, when she starts writing the problems, you will actually see what she is writing. So if the PowerPoint is slightly delayed or behind, don't worry about that as much as being able to make sure you see what's on the video screen where Stephanie and I are currently sitting, and make sure that you see the content related there. So if you have any other questions, please feel free to submit them as questions. I don't see things, I have tech issues. We will answer them on here on this side, but you'll have the PowerPoint afterwards. The most important thing is to make sure you can see Stephanie and I, and then ultimately what Stephanie is showing. So thank you for sending in your questions. Please keep sending them if you have any problems on the slides. So go ahead, I'm sorry, Steph.
Perfect, no problem. So again, we're just talking about the different concepts. So again, the 3 different content areas, arithmetic, algebra, geometry, are what you're going to be testing on the GMAT quant section. So keep in mind, there is no trigonometry, there is no calculus or any high-level math subject areas on the GMAT. The highest level that you'll need to know something about is the geometry. So these are things, again, you want to brush up on. There's some really great books out there you can get to brush up on. But you don't want, when you have 2 minutes to answer a question, you don't want to spend your 2 minutes, thinking about the equation. You want to spend your 2 minutes trying to, multiply or divide with decimals. Really, that should be taking you, roughly seconds to do that. And then you're spending your bulk of your time addressing the question, figuring out what to do with the question. And then you're, the last few minutes of the, or last few seconds actually, doing the actual math part of it. So
That's a question that came in. I want to make sure we address before you move on.
Sure.
And it's about when the questions become more difficult. So as you answer questions correctly and they become more difficult, should a person see questions that take longer to answer? Or should it simply be that the question is harder but doesn't take you, more time? So should I be assuming 2 minutes per question is going to always need to be 2 minutes per question? Or as it gets harder, should I take more time?
So that's a great question. And really it just depends on you as a person. Some questions that, some people spend 5-6 minutes doing, as they're practicing. As you continue to practice, you'll be able to do that problem in less and less time. So ideally, every question on the GMAT, you can certainly answer in 2 minutes. If you are skilled and you recognize what to do with the problem and you recognize how to attack the problem pretty quickly, you can address that question in 2 minutes for sure. If you can't, it's just because you have, there's some rough patches. Maybe you need to work on some of your computations and working on those quicker, or maybe it took you a little bit longer to figure out how to approach the problem, or maybe you went down the wrong path. But every question on the GMAT can be answered in 2 minutes. It may not feel that way at first, but trust me, with a lot of practice and time, you'll get to that point where you can address them. But again, this is on average, so it's important that I say that some problems will take you more than 2 minutes, and that's okay. You may spend 3 minutes, 3.5 minutes on question number 1 because it is the most important question that you're going to see on the test. So if that means that you're going to time out and not answer all 37 quant questions, that's okay as well. You can still get a really high score on the GMAT not having answered all the questions. So that's important to keep in mind. So yeah, you can spend 2.5 minutes, 3 minutes on a question, and some questions may take you 1 or 1.5 minutes, and so it kind of balances out, evens out about 2 minutes per question. And there may be some questions again that allow you to spend where you spend more than enough time, or more than the time you have allotted. But if at the point where the clock is running out and you have 2 minutes left, and you maybe have 4 or 5 questions you haven't answered, it's always best to click through and put something versus leaving the questions unanswered. So a blank answer or unanswered question is like getting a question wrong. So it's always best to put something than to leave it unanswered. But certainly, it will average out to be 2 minutes per question if you answer all the questions. Otherwise, spend a little bit more time to guarantee you're getting those questions right so that you're advancing and getting some of the harder questions. Harder just means a concept that people have tested and didn't score as well on. You can still answer it in 2 minutes. It just means it's something that a lot of people struggle with, or a lot of people, end up getting that question incorrect. So,
right.
And we're going to see some of those higher level GMAT questions today. And so you'll see that some of these questions are not so difficult if you understand how to approach them. And that's really the key to doing well in this part of the test, is recognizing what to do with it pretty quickly and then approaching it in the most simplistic way possible. With math, there's always more than one way to do a problem. There's never just one way. That's the thing about math. You can approach it from the front door, the back door, the side door, the window. So there's always different approaches, but what's the quickest way to do the problem is what we want to spend some time talking about today, so that you recognize, okay, there's different strategies, different ways to do something, and so maybe the way you've been doing it is a little bit longer than it needs to be. So we'll talk about some of those time-saving techniques and strategies you can use such that you're not spending too much time answering a question.
Fabulous. So I'll let us move on. So while Stephanie's going to the next section, we're going to get ready to get into the questions now. Thank you for your questions. They've all been great. She's answered most of them on air. One that you didn't get a chance to answer that I think we'll kind of hold to the end, and you can think through, is sort of test prep and trying to figure out, for those people locally asking about where to do test prep, I only recommend Stephanie. 1, because she's fabulous. 2, because she's an alum. But 3, because I think she really does a fabulous job of explaining to prospective students and those taking the GMAT sort of how to think through it in a one-on-one basis. So all of Stephanie's information will be available at the end of the presentation, but she can give you some more detail towards the end of it as well as to how to pick a test prep if you're not here locally, if you're not able to be able to take her services here in Georgia.
Perfect. All right, so we're ready to move on to our first question, our first problem-solving question. We have 5 of these, and then we'll have 5 DS questions, and then we'll get into the verbal part of the test. So the first question you'll see is PS 116. So again, these questions are coming from the official GMAT study guidebook written by the GMAC. This is the 13th edition, so you can reference this book later on. If you have it in front of you, that's great. You can follow along, but this is just so you know where we're pulling these questions from. So the first question.
So I'm going to go ahead and read through the questions for it. You all should be seeing question number 1, PS 116, with a concept tested and level. So if you don't see that, again, you can hit refresh if you need to get that slide up. But again, she'll be addressing how to answer it, and it will stay up on the screen for the duration of time. So the question is, if P is the product of the integers from 1 to 30 inclusive, what is the greatest integer K for which 3K is a factor of P? And you can see the 5 answers that are there. So as you should be able to see now, Stephanie's iPad screen, where she's going to begin writing out how the question should be answered. The concepts that are going to be tested in this are the definitions of product, integer, inclusive, and factor. So this gets back to Stephanie's point that the concepts are more important than actually knowing the answer to the problem. Simply, do you have enough information about those concepts such that you can answer the questions? And you're also looking at exponents, factors, and multiples. This is considered, from a test level, Stephanie, right, a mid-500s, correct?
Right. So this could be one of the first questions you see on your GMAT.
Correct.
So this kind of gives you an idea of, if you were sitting for the GMAT tomorrow, this could be one of the first questions that you see on your test. So that gives you some idea of the difficulty level of the question.
Fabulous. Okay, so this will be up on the screen to the side, and then Stephanie's going to go ahead and walk you through how to solve this problem.
Okay, perfect. So there's a lot of definitions in this question that we have to understand. So again, it reads, if P is the product, so the word product, hopefully you know that means to multiply. Okay, so product means to multiply. We're going to multiply integers. Integers are whole numbers, positive and negative, including 0. But we're multiplying integers from 1 to 30. So we're looking at 1 times 2 times 3 times 4 times 5, all the way times 28, 29, until we get to 30, and we stop at 30. So whatever this product equals is P. Okay, so that's P. Now, obviously, I didn't mention this earlier, but it was on the slide. There is no calculator allowed on the quantitative part of the GMAT. So we're not expected to actually come up with this huge number for P. Okay, this number is, a huge number. It's multiplying all these numbers together. There has to be a shorter way to getting to figuring out the value, the greatest integer for K. But this just illustrates what P represents. And then the question continues to say, well, let me go back and look at this word inclusive. Inclusive means including the 1 and including the 30. Okay, so we're including those two endpoints, the 1 and the 30. If it did not say inclusive, the opposite of that would be something like between. If it said between, the P would be the product of the integers between 1 and 30, we would not include the 1 or the 30. We'd just start with 2 and end at 29. But because it says the word inclusive, we are going to include the 1 and we are going to include the 30 in this product. Okay? Now, the question says, what is the greatest integer K for which 3 to the K is a factor of P? So what does this part factor of P mean? Factor of P. Factor is another word for divisor. Okay, so it's important to know that a factor is a divisor. What can be divided into P? So if we have these numbers, these integers, from 1 to 30, we want to know the greatest integer K, for which 3 to the K is a divisor, can be divided into P. Now, this K hanging at the top up here is called an exponent. And the exponent tells us how many 3's in this case we have that can be divided into P. So K represents the number of 3's that can be divided into P. So for example, if K equaled 2, then we have 3 to the 2, which is 3 times 3. If K equaled 3, then we have 3 to the 3, which is 3 times 3 times 3. We'll have 3 3's. But we want to know how many 3's, how many of these do we have that can be divided into our product P. So in order to figure that out, we need to first look at the numbers that we wrote out for P, okay, all the way to 30, and look at these numbers and determine which numbers can be divided by 3. Which numbers are what we call multiples of 3. So we can start with number 3. We know 3 is divided by 3. So is 6. So is 9, 12, 15, 18, 21, 24, 27, and 30. So of all the products, all the integers from 1 to 30, these are the only integers that are multiples of 3. So when we look at all these integers, we need to figure out, for example, the 6, how many 3's do we have that are products in the number 6. We can break that down to 3 and 2. So there's a 3 here. 9 we can break down into 3 times 3. So there's 2 3s and 9. 12 is 3 times 4. So there's 1 3 and 12. There's 1 3 and 15. 18 is 3 times 6, and 6 is 3 times 2. So there's 2 3s and 18. 21 is 3 times 7. There's a 3 and 21. 24 is 3 times 8. There's another 3 and 24. 27 is 3 times 9, and 9 has 2 more 3s. So there's 3 3s and 27. And 30 is 3 times 10. There's 1 3 there. So we count up all of our 3s. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, which means 3 to the 14th is a factor of P. So in our case, the greatest number of 3s, the greatest integer for K, which means the greatest number of 3s that can be divided into P is 14. So 14 is the correct answer to this question.
Got it. So you should see on your screen where Stephanie has identified C14 is the correct answer. And then the detail that's kind of laid out here. So because, Stephanie, I'm making sure I'm qualifying this because there's a question in for this. Because this is a problem solving, I need to get the answer, not
Exactly.
do I have enough information?
Right.
Would a problem like this be presented on the data sufficiency? And if so, how would they ask that?
Sure, any question can be sort of rewritten so that it fits a DS question type. So, for example, if it was written as a DS question, it would say, it would give you some information, P is the product from 1 to 30 inclusive, or P is the product of, 1 to N maybe. Maybe instead of giving you the 30, it would give you another variable N, right? Inclusive, what's the greatest integer for K? And then statement 1 could read something like N equals 30. Mm-hmm. So if you know N equals 30, then you could find out the value for K. Mm-hmm. If you didn't know what N was, then you couldn't figure out the value for K, for example.
Okay, so that would be so if they gave you what N was, you'd need to know in the problem that N is the missing piece of information necessary for you to answer the question.
Exactly.
Got it. Okay.
And without that number for N, you wouldn't be able to figure out how many 3s there were. You wouldn't be able to figure out the value for K. Exactly. So you need to know what those two endpoints are to figure out at one point, what's the lowest number, what's the highest number, what's the range of numbers you're looking at to figure out how many 3s are a factor of that product.
Got it. Okay. Again, you guys can continue to submit your questions. Thank you for that question. Continue to submit your questions, and I'll make sure we ask them as Stephanie is going along so they can address any of the concerns or thoughts you have. So we're going to move to the second question?
Yes. Before we move on, just to go backwards 1 second. So this is sort of an example of, you mentioned earlier, the different concepts you need to know. Things like, what does the product mean? What's an integer? A lot of people, are not clear on these definitions. So when they read a problem like this, they don't know what to do with it because they don't know what the terms in the question mean. Mm-hmm. Exponent, the K in this problem is an exponent. Most people, may not understand what an exponent is. The exponent just tells you how many of a number you have. If I had 2 to the K, then I would be counting the number of 2s, for example. So that could have easily have changed this question so that they were asking me for 2 to the K versus 3 to the K. Mm-hmm. And then I'll also note that 3 is a prime number, and that's not a coincidence, okay? So if they had asked me 4 to the K, that would be more difficult because 4 can be broken down to 2 times 2. Mm-hmm. So if I was looking at a number like 16, I wouldn't know if it was 2 4s or if it was 4 2s, right? So they would not ask me to find 4 to the K in a problem like this because 4 is not a prime number. But 5 to the K or 7 to the K or 11 to the K are all, other variations of this same type of problem that you could see on the test.
So the important thing to note, it sounds like from a takeaway, is if you're seeing things and it's a prime number, a model of how to answer a problem like you just modeled out would only work for prime numbers.
Exactly.
That's good to know.
Yes.
Okay.
Otherwise, if it was a DS question and they gave you a number that wasn't prime, a composite number, then again you would say insufficient. You wouldn't be able to tell if it was a 4 to the K, how many 4s there are, how many 2s there are, because 4 is not a prime number.
Got it. Okay.
All right, so moving on, we're going to look at the next problem now, which is problem solving 151.
Fabulous. Okay, so the question you can see on your screen, PS 151, reads, at a loading dock, each worker on the night crew loaded 3/4 as many boxes as each worked on the day crew. If the night crew has 4/5 as many workers as the day crew, what fraction of all the boxes loaded by the 2 crews did the day crew load? You see the 5 answers that are there. The concepts being tested are translating words into operations and fractions. So Stephanie, this is a high 500s to low 600s. So this is more difficult, it sounds like, than the prior question.
Yeah, so we're gonna continue to progress in difficulty level. So this will be, the next question you could see on your test. So it's a higher level question than the previous one. This is a word problem. A lot of people see all these words and they get a little shaky because it's too many words in the problem. But if you take the problem and you sort of break it down, sentence by sentence, phrase by phrase, I promise you, the problem that once seemed daunting to you is actually not that bad. So let's kind of go back to the beginning. And you'll see on your screen, I've already started to sort of outline what I'm a huge fan of, which is a diagram, a table, a chart, a picture, something to help us figure out all the pieces of the problem and get that down on paper. So the first thing we're told here is that we have two crews. We have a day crew and we have a night crew. And it says that each worker on the night crew loaded 3/4 as many boxes as each worker on the day crew. So I like this problem because what I can do is use a strategy called pick a number, and I'll tell you why we can use that problem at the end. But picking a number, I can choose how many boxes I want the crews to load, because there's a relationship between the number of boxes that each crew loads. So if I say the day crew loads 4 boxes per worker, then that means the night crew, who loaded 3/4 as many, loaded 3/4 times 4, or 3 boxes per worker. So why did I choose the number 4 instead of a number like 5 or a number like 6? When I choose my numbers, I want to choose a number that eliminates my fractions. So I knew I was going to have to multiply the number of boxes per worker that the day crew loaded by 3/4. So choosing 4 allowed me to cancel out my denominator so that I'm left with 3 boxes per worker. I'm left with an integer value for the number of boxes per worker for the night crew. If I would have chosen 5 for the day crew per worker, I would have ended up with 5 3/4 times 5, which we see as a fraction. I cannot simplify that to get an integer, so choosing 5 would not have been the best number to choose. Okay, so I chose 4, so therefore there's 4 boxes per worker for the day crew and 3 boxes per worker for the night crew. So moving on, the question says, if the night crew has 4/5 as many workers, so now we're looking at the number of workers versus the boxes, as the day crew. So again, I get to pick another number for the day crew. So I'm going to choose a multiple of my denominator. So I'm going to choose 5. 5 workers for the day crew, which means I have 4 workers on the night crew. Okay, 4/5 times 5, the 5s cancel. I'm left with 4 workers there. So now if I look at the night crew and I have 4 workers, each worker loaded 3 boxes, I can do that multiplication and figure out that 12 boxes were loaded all together. So this is the total boxes loaded. Okay, on the day crew, if I have 5 workers and each worker loaded 4 boxes, then that gives me a total of 20 boxes loaded by the day crew. And if I combine the two, the night crew loaded 12, the day crew loaded 20. If I add these two, I get the total number loaded, which is 20 plus 12, which is 32. So it's the total number of boxes loaded by the 2 crews. So the question's asking me of what fraction, so I'm going to move on to the next page, what fraction of all the boxes loaded did the day crew load? So this 32 represents all the boxes loaded. And I want to know what fraction of the day crew loads. So day crew, the boxes for the day crew is my numerator, and the total boxes for both crews is my denominator. And I knew that the day crew loaded 20 boxes. The total boxes was 32. So if I reduce that fraction, we'll get 5/8 for our fraction of boxes loaded by the day crew. Okay, so I mentioned earlier that I chose numbers. I was able to pick a number for this problem. And the key to picking numbers, when can you pick numbers, when can you not pick numbers, is looking for those keywords in the question. The keyword in this question was what fraction. When I see something like what fraction, I know that regardless of the numbers I pick, regardless of what my numerator and my denominator are in the problem, I'm going to reduce my answer to get 5/8, regardless of what I started with. So if I had not started with 4 boxes for the day crew and 5 workers for the day crew and started with something different, I would have gotten different answers. I wouldn't have gotten a 20 or 30. I would have gotten a different total for the total boxes and total boxes for the day crew. But regardless, I would have still reduced and ended up with 5/8 as my fraction of day crew over total boxes loaded.
Okay, so we got a lot of really good questions in here for this one.
Okay, great.
The first thing I'll address is I know a lot of you have been asking to see more of her actual screen while she's talking. So I know it's helpful to hear and see Stephanie. We'll make sure we give you a little bit more time to see what she's writing. But once she clears the screen, we can't go back to that portion. So that's where the video sent to you later on will be helpful for you if you want to pause and take down that portion. So I would say definitely follow along with the video. We'll leave the screen up as long as possible while she's talking. So you'll end up hearing her and seeing her less. So we'll definitely make sure we take care of that. So thank you for that question. But the second question was, you mentioned the idea of picking a number. And so the question is, in particular, what type of problems could you use pick a number charts for? So what are some of the indicators? You mentioned what fraction is one of them. What are some of the indicators in a question that let you know to use the pick a number format?
That's a great question. There's really 3 different types of questions where you can pick a number. Okay, there's 3 different types. This type we see in PS 151 is what we call a what fraction problem. Anytime you're asked to find what fraction of something, you can pick a number because, again, as I mentioned, picking numbers, it doesn't matter what numbers you pick. Your final answer should be the same reduced answer as the next person who picked a different set of numbers. So as long as you follow the rules in the question, your final result will be the final answer, your final result will be the exact same as someone who picked this different set of numbers. So what fraction is the first type of problem where you can pick numbers? The second type is what we call how many. Okay, the how many questions that you'll see on the test are also problems where you can pick a number. So how many numbers are prime, or how many numbers are factors of a certain number. For example, you can actually count those numbers, and whatever your count is your answer. So again, regardless of what you're picking to plug into the question, your final count is going to be the same. So your how many problems is another type of problem where you can pick a number. And last but not least, the third type and most popular type is the VIC problems, the variables and the choices. When you see variables and the answer choices, you can also pick numbers, because what you're doing is you're picking a number, you're plugging into the question, you're solving based on what you plugged in, and then you're matching that to your answer choices. So whichever one matches your answer choice is the correct response to that question. So this is called variables and the choices, VIC, and that's a third type of question where you can pick a number.
Fabulous. So I'm going to make sure we keep ourselves moving through here. Again, keep your questions coming in. That was very, very helpful. We're going to move to the third question. Which you can see here. I put the answer up briefly for it from a slide standpoint, that the answer is E, 5/8, as Stephanie went through that. As well, you'll have this deck afterwards, so you don't necessarily need to focus on that portion. The next question is PS 186. And so I'll go ahead, and you should see that on your screen. I'll go ahead and read the question out. Of 30 applicants for a job, 14 had at least 4 years experience, 18 had degrees, and 3 had less than 4 years experience and did not have a degree. How many of the applicants had at least 4 years experience and a degree? And you'll see your 5 options there. Your concepts being tested right now is overlapping sets. So Stephanie will talk to you a little bit about this. This question is, of course, more difficult than the prior, and this is mid to high 600s. So one thing to note is the number of concepts included in it doesn't necessarily mean the question is more difficult than another. As you saw in the first one, there were lots of concepts in that first one, but it was a mid 500s. Here we have a mid to high 600s with a single concept being tested, but a more difficult concept overall to understand. So Stephanie, as you can see on here, is building out a Venn diagram to explain to you how to answer this question. So Stephanie?
Right. So anytime you have a problem that has overlapping information, you can represent that using a Venn diagram. And there's lots and lots of problems in this official guidebook that require you to use a Venn diagram or represent something to represent that overlapping information. So in this case, we're given 2 different sort of categories. We're given the first category for experience, for greater years of experience, and the second category for a degree. So this means yes, you have a degree. And if you don't have a degree and if you don't have experience, you're in this neither category outside of the circles. And if you have both, you're right here in the middle where it overlaps with the two circles. So if we read the question again, we notice that there's 30 applicants in total. So our total number of applicants we can write to the side. Okay, that's our total population. 30 applicants for a job. It says 14 of them had at least 4 years experience. So in this first circle where we have our experience, there's 14 people that have at least 4 years of experience. So that means 4 more years of experience. Then it says 18 had degrees. So in the second circle, we have 18 people out here who have a degree. And then it says 3 had less than 4 years experience, and no degree. So these neither, the people outside of the circles, would be these 3 people who have neither a degree nor do they have the experience. And we're trying to figure out how many of the applicants have both, have the experience and also have a degree. So how many people overlap these 2 circles? How many people are right here in the middle that have both a degree and that have the 4 years experience? Okay, so how do we solve for x? We have our visual here. How do we figure out what this value x is, this number in the middle of people that represent both? So we can use a handy equation. I'm going to move on to the next screen. We can use a handy equation that we can use for really any problem that involves overlapping information. So we take our first circle, we add our second circle, okay? Because these 2 circles include the overlap, we have to subtract out the overlap because we're including them twice. And then we also want to add in the people that have neither to give us our total population. All right, so this is a general equation that you can use for any Venn diagram problem where you have overlapping information in 2 different categories. So in this case, we have our total is 30, we know that. Our circle 1, which is our experience circle, we have 14 people with experience, 4 or more years of experience. Our second circle in this case is people who have a degree, and we're told 18 have degrees, we add the 18. And then we're trying to figure out what the x is, the people who have both. So we're going to subtract out x, because again, x is included in both the 14 and the 18. And then we need to add in the people who have neither. So we're told that 3 people had no degree and also didn't have the experience. So we have our equation here. We can figure out what x is, and then x will tell us what our answer is. So we can simply add our 14 plus 18 plus 3, and then we can subtract that from 30 to figure out x. And so when we do that, we'll get x equals 5. Okay?
Fabulous. So I think that the one thing, and I'll leave this up on the screen for a little bit while I'm talking through it just so you can see how to digest it. But one thing that Stephanie has given you here that's really key to take away is the idea that the concepts that you're going with, when there are trigger words that you see here, you can know how to approach it. So one of the questions that came in is, what was the trigger here that lets you know it's an overlapping set concept? So what should they have seen to see that this is how you should go about it as an overlapping set?
Yes. So the keyword, and that's a great question because you always want to look for the keywords in the problem to help you figure out how to answer, how to approach the problem. So here, when I saw that I had, people with experience, and people with degrees, and I have 3 that have, neither one, and I want to know how many have both. The key is how many have both, right? That's my key, that I'm looking for that middle, right? That middle sort of, overlapping information. The middle part of the 2 concentric circles that say, okay, they have a degree and they have the experience. Mm-hmm. So that last part of the question, how many of the applicants had the experience and the degree? That's the both part that I'm looking for.
Great. So when you're looking at that, the good thing to take away for you guys as prospects who are getting ready to take this test is that's your trigger to think about how to make the concentric circles. And what Stephanie showed you on creating that is an easy formula that you can apply in multiple manners, but that's the trigger. And so to her point, as you're going through these problems, think about the trigger. It's also one that should let you know an overlapping set question is a high or a higher level of difficulty. So if you're trying to, during the test, sort of gauge and see where you are, an overlapping sets kind of question is a higher level of difficulty than integers and other portions. So that should be something that lets you know where you're progressing on the general test scale.
But it's interesting that you say that because you can take an overlapping set question, you can make it a 500 level question, you can make it a 600 level question, you can make it a 700 level question. So there's several of these questions in the official guidebook, and they are different level difficulties. This is one example, but you'll, as you start to study more and you go through this book, you'll come across other examples as well, and you'll see how they just, tweak a little bit of information to make it a little bit more difficult than the previous one.
So making sure they understand that this concept can live at all levels.
Exactly. This is a concept that no matter the difficulty level, you can apply the same equation and get this. And you'll also see questions like this in the DS section of the test as well. Okay. So this is very popular DAS efficiency question type. You'll see these come up time and time again in that part of the book as well.
Before we leave this, the last question we just got in is this the only method to use for this kind of problem?
Oh, definitely not. Like I said earlier, with math, there's always more than one way to do a problem. So for some people who prefer a table, for example, You can certainly set this up in a table format, similar to what I did with the last problem when I had the day crew workers and the night crew workers, etc. You can set this up in a table format as well. There's never just one way, but you want to think about what's the quickest way to solve a problem. And that to me, the quickest way is using the Venn diagram, and it's something that is also usable for all problems that have overlapping information. So if you have something that you can use more than one time, then certainly that's a tool that you can use over and over again. So here's a problem where, yes, you could have done a different way and still gotten the same answer, but a tool like the Venn diagram is a tool that you can use for so many different types of problems that you want to get comfortable learning how to do that.
Good question. And then the last question is, in the official guide, which we don't have up on the screen, but Stephanie referenced here, how do you know what level each question is in the guide?
Excellent question as well. So the questions in this book are increasing in difficulty. So if I open up the book to, and I'll hold this up in a second. If I open up to the answer key, which has, all, let's see, 230 problem-solving questions. So I'm going to hold this up so you can see it. Okay, there's 230 problem-solving questions in the book. Now, if they're moving from order of difficulty, I know that number 1 should be the easiest question in the book, and number 230 is considered to be the hardest question in the book. Okay, so if I do a rough estimation, I can roughly estimate from 91 to 150 to be sort of my 500 level GMAT questions, PS questions, okay? And things that are to the left of that, lower than that, will be my 300s and my 400s. And questions that are higher than that are my 6s and my 7s. So this is all sort of approximation because it's subjective, right? Some people would find some questions more difficult than other people. People may find number 1 to be really hard, but number 172 to be really easy. This is all subjective, but according to the GMAT, this is sort of how they arrange the questions in the book according to how they presume the difficulty level to be. So when I say on the problems, this is this level problem or that level problem, it's just a rough estimation based on how it's positioned in the book. So the higher the number in the book, and the highest number for the PS is 230. So the higher it gets to 230, the more difficult the questions are, according to the GMAT.
Perfect. Okay, we're going to keep moving, and I'm actually going to move us along in that we're going to do just one more question in the problem-solving section so we can make sure we get to data sufficiency and leave a little bit of time to go through the verbal section. So Stephanie, question 4 or question 5? Which would you like to do?
Let's see. Let's go with let's do the next one, question 4.
So we're going to do question 4. Again, when you get the slides, you will still see the question on question 5, and you'll also see the concepts that are included in that. So you won't lose that element of it. But I want to make sure we have enough time to get to data sufficiency, which is unique to the GMAT, and thus I want to make sure you see that. So the question she's chosen is PS 215, and it reads, Xavier, Yvonne, and Zelda each try independently to solve a problem. If their individual probabilities for success are 1/4, 1/2, and 5/8, respectively, what is the probability that Xavier and Yvonne, but not Zelda, will solve their problem? And your answers are there. This is the concept testing of probability. And this question is a harder one, high 600, low 700. So this is the kind of stuff, this kind of problem in this manner is what you want to see to really be in that sweet spot of top business school and top business school responses. So Stephanie is going ahead and modeling this question out. I'll let her walk through it.
Perfect. So you'll see that for a lot of these word problems, hopefully you're seeing by now with 4 questions in, that I'm setting these up using a table. Okay, tables are your friends. You always want to get the information organized first before you then go and try to solve it. So I have this table here. X stands for Xavier, Y for Yvonne, Z for Zelda. I have their chance of success and their chance for not success. So it tells us that their individual probabilities for success are 1/4, 1/2, and 5/8 respectively. So in that order is what respectively means. So 1/4 for Xavier, 1/2 for Zelda, and 5 for Yvonne, and 5/8 for Zelda. Okay, that's their chance that they're going to answer a problem correctly. So in order to figure out the chance for not answering it correctly, for probability, what you do is you take 1 minus what you don't want to equal what you actually want. So if I want to know the chance for not success, I take 1 minus the chance for success to get the chance for not succeeding, for example. So 1 minus 1/4, 1 minus 1/2, and 1 minus 5/8 will give me the chance that they don't answer the problem correctly. So for Xavier, that's 3/4. For Yvonne, that's 1/2, and for Zelda, that's 3/8. Okay, the chance for not answering the problem correctly. If I add the chance for correct versus incorrect, I should equal 100%, right? There's only two different options here. Either you answer correctly or you don't. And those two things should add up to give us 1 or 100%.
So that's how you got the 1, Stephanie.
Yes.
In essence, is the total needs to be 1 for the probability of success or not success.
Exactly.
So if they're asking you for 2 categories of things, apply or don't apply, run or don't run,
Exactly.
the alternative is whatever probability you are given, 1 minus that probability has to be the total of the option.
That's exactly right.
Fabulous.
Exactly
Okay.
right. So again, if you look at it, a smaller example, something like the chance of flipping a coin, right? Either you have heads or you have tails. So there's a 1/2 chance you get heads and a 1/2 chance you get tails. And if you add them together, you get, 2 halves, which is 1. So those are the only 2 options you can have, and the total of those 2 options should equal 1 or 100%.
Fabulous. Okay.
So in this problem, it's asking us what's the probability that Xavier and Yvonne, so we want Xavier and Yvonne to succeed. But the key there says, but not Zelda. So not Zelda means we need to take her chance of not answering the question correctly. So when we do our probability, we take the 1/2 for Xavier, the 1/4 for Xavier, the 1/2 for Yvonne, the 3/8 for Zelda. Because we want all 3 things to happen, we multiply them together to get our chance of those 3 things occurring. So if we take the 1/2, the 1/4, and the 3/8, 1/2, 1/4, 3/8, and we multiply them by each other, we'll get our answer, which ends up being 3/64. Okay, so that's end up choice E.
So I want to make sure, because the question that came in before about the 1, the reason you knew to multiply them is because all of those things have to take place.
Exactly.
Right. So
Exactly.
Xavier and Yvonne have to succeed, and Zelda has to not succeed. Ergo, all of those things need to be multiplied.
Exactly.
What would be an indicator to let you know to do something different, either add or subtract or divide?
Great question. So if I was, let's say, pulling a jelly bean from a container. Let's say I have a container and I have like 5 red and I have 3 yellow and I have 8 blue, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I'm going to pull a red or a yellow, okay, red or yellow. Then I add those 2 probabilities together. So let's see, our total is 16. So we have 5 out of 16 red, and then we have 3 out of 16 yellow. So the chance of me getting a red or a yellow jelly bean would be adding these 2 fractions together. So 8 out of 16, or there's a 1/2 chance that I'll get a red or a yellow. If I wanted a red and a yellow, that's different. Okay? And I'm going to multiply, or I'm going to add.
Okay, so there's a question that just came in, which I think you've answered, but I want to make sure. The question is that we multiplied in that case. Does that make these independent events or dependent events? And so it sounds like multiplication is dependent events.
Well, it depends.
Okay.
It depends. Let's see. An example of independent would be flipping a coin and rolling a dice. They have nothing to do with each other, right?
Mm-hmm.
Dependent means they have something to do with each other. Dependent would be the probability of me choosing a senior who's a female, right? Or senior who's a male. Those 2 things can overlap, sort of. So independent means they don't overlap. Rolling a dice, flipping a coin, they have nothing to do with each other.
Okay.
But when I pick a senior, or a junior or a freshman or a sophomore, and I pick a male or a female, those 2 things can overlap. Those are dependent.
Okay.
Okay, so in this example, their chance of succeeding had nothing to do with each other, right? They're independent. They're completely separate from each other.
So in this case, we multiplied, and these events are independent. So it's not.
Right.
We would have to have said that Xavier's success is dependent on Yvonne's or on Zelda's in order for them to be dependent events.
Right, right. So in this case, because they say independent and they give us these 3 probabilities, and we want to know the chance that all 3 things will happen. Okay, we want all 3 things to happen, so we multiply. And when you multiply fractions, the fractions get smaller. So if you look at the answer choices, any fraction that is bigger doesn't make sense, right? Our fraction should not be a bigger fraction. It should be a smaller fraction because we're multiplying fractions together, and we multiply fractions together that are all less than 1. The overall fraction is smaller than the pieces that make up that fraction. So in this case, choice A, which is bigger than 1, 11 over 8 is greater than 1. So that doesn't make any sense to have a probability that's greater than 1. So A is automatically eliminated just based on being greater than 1. B is 7 over 8, which is greater than the individual fractions, right? So again, that's not going to be it because that's greater than the individual probabilities. Not going to work. So when we look at these, we want to, A and B are automatically eliminated because they just are either greater than 1 or they're bigger than our initial fractions. Because again, we multiply fractions where they're less than 1, our product should be a smaller number than the individual fractions that made up the product.
Fabulous. I think that was a great explanation, kind of going through the different details. And so I want to make sure that we've gone through these conceptually. You'll have an additional one that Stephanie will not be able to walk through today that we're going to try, because we're going to move to the data sufficiency now. We've got about 35 minutes left. We may run a little bit over, so if you can stay on for a little while longer to get through the verbal side of it, we definitely will. But I'm going to move us on to data sufficiency. Please continue to ask your questions. They have been great. And I think it's helpful while she's here to be able to ask her specifics that are there. So we're going to move on to the data sufficiency portion. And Stephanie is talking a little bit here about data sufficiency answer choices.
Yes.
And that'll explain how this will work, and then we'll get into the problems themselves. So Stephanie?
Yes, so you'll see on this slide the answer choice is A, B, C, D, E for DS questions. So this is, again, the part of the test that is more, that's not as familiar to you than the other parts of this test. This is probably the part that most people struggle with because it is very different. And the way you think about these questions is a different way of thinking than what most people are used to. So the first thing is you have to know what A, B, C, D, E mean. Okay, they're not answer choices like the problem-solving questions where you have values or you pick the best answer. Instead, they have different meanings. So A means that statement 1 alone is sufficient, but not statement 2. B means that statement 2 alone is sufficient, but not statement 1. C means that I need both together to be sufficient. By themselves, they're not. D means that each of them by themselves is sufficient. And then E means basically you can't tell. You don't have enough information to say whether you're sufficient or not. So basically it means neither one together or independently are sufficient. So you should know what these 5 choices mean really, really well before you go take the GMAT for sure. So you don't have to keep reading them on your screen. And then also know the bottom, it says that in DS problems that ask for a value, there's 2 different types of DS questions. They'll kind of ask for a value. So how old is Tim? What's the value for X? Versus the kind that asks a yes or no. Is Tim older than John? Is X greater than Y? That's a yes or no. Versus how old is Tim is a value. So the kind that asks for a value, there should be only one value. If there's more than one value, then you're insufficient. You can't determine the one value. But if there's only one, then you're sufficient. Okay, and again, you stop at the point where you know you're sufficient. You don't keep going to get the value. Once you know you can get the value, you must stop and move on to the next question.
Because trying to solve it will take too much of your time, correct?
Exactly. And again, 2 minutes on average per question. There's not enough time to solve all of these. So you stop at the point where you can answer, and I'll show you that with some examples today. On the next screen, you'll see an illustration of a diagram of how to eliminate answer choices. So the key thing is to set up your sheet with A, D, B, C, E as your choices. A and D in one column, B, C, E in the second column. And you'll see here how we can eliminate answer choices based on the statements 1 and the statements 2. So the first question we're going to ask ourselves is statement 1 sufficient? If we say yes, we're on the left-hand side of that diagram, and we continue down that tree. If we say no, we're on the right-hand side of the diagram, we continue down that branch of the tree. So if we say yes, we're eliminating the second column. The B, C, E choices are already eliminated, which means they're not options. At this point, if we had to make a guess, we guess between A or D. Okay, we will not guess B, we'll not guess C, we'll not guess E. Those are incorrect if statement 1 is sufficient. All right, then we continue, we look at statement 2. If that's sufficient, we choose D. If it's not, we choose A. Okay, now going back to statement 1, if that wasn't sufficient, we're on the right-hand side of the diagram. We answer the question no. We eliminate the first column. A and D are now gone. The 3 choices that remain are B, C, and E. We look at statement 2. If that statement is sufficient, we choose B and we are done. There's no reason to pick C or E if 2 by itself is sufficient. If 2 is not sufficient, that's the only time we look at both statements together. So now we take them both together, 1 and 2 together. If together they're sufficient, we choose C. If together they're not sufficient, we choose E and we move on. Okay, so it's really important that you understand A, B, A, D, B, C, E. what those answer choices mean and how to eliminate one column or the other column to get to your final answer.
So I'm going to put this up, and then when Stephanie is talking through this, I will make sure that I reference back to this slide, because this is critically important. This right here should save you an enormous amount of time on the test. Because as she mentioned earlier, an empty question, like not answered, is wrong. So even if you're just narrowing it down to a choice between A and D or a choice between B, C, and E, it is infinitely easier for you to go through it in that regard. So I'm going to go ahead and let you get to the first question with this, but I will leave this up on the screen after I go through the question, and because she'll be writing it out so that you can think through that portion of it, okay? So your first question we have up here is DS, data sufficiency question number 72. It reads, if M is an integer, is M odd? 1, M over 2 is not an even integer. 2, M minus 3 is an even integer. The concepts we're testing here are integers and even and odd rules, and this is a 500 level question. So before we get into it, because we've got a lot of questions in this, before we get into this, making sure as we're looking at this question here, you're going to get statement 1 and 2. Can you write out the columns? Like, what should somebody be remembering when they're doing this, since they're not going to be able to bring in that kind of column chart? Can you, how should they account for it and set up on a scratch piece of paper when they first get in there or something?
Yes, so the first thing I do with DS questions is write down my A, D, B, C, E, which are written on the top right here. So A, D, B, C is the first thing I write down because, again, that's going to help me figure out, do I eliminate the first column or the second column? Okay, so that's already on my paper. I also write down the given information, so my G stands for given, and then I write down what I'm trying to find, so my F stands for find. Okay, so G for given. So in this problem that I was given, that M is an integer. That's free information. Okay, M is an integer. So I know an integer is a whole number, positive or negative, including 0. So I'm not dealing with any fractions or any decimals with the number, the value for M, whatever it is. And then my find is M an odd? Is M odd? Okay, so this is a yes or no question. Either yes is odd, yes it is, or no it isn't. Okay, so it's an example of a yes or no DS question. All right, so now at this point I'm ready to look at my first statement. So my first statement says that M over 2 is not an even integer. Okay, so if it's not an even integer, then what is it? Okay, there's two options. Either it's an odd integer, right? Or it's not an integer at all. Right? It doesn't have to be an integer at all. So not even doesn't just imply odd. Not even means it could be odd or it could be a fraction, right? So not integer means there's a fraction or a decimal. But it just means it's not going to be a whole number. It's not going to be an integer. So if we look at statement 1, and we say, okay, we know M is an integer. If we divide M by 2, we're not going to get something that's even. So let's say we just say M was 9. We're going to just pick a number for M. M is 9. So when I take 9 and divide it by 2, what do I get? I get something that's not even, right? Which means M could be something like 9 because I don't get an even answer when I divide it by 2. Okay, so in this case, if M is 9, I go back to my question, is M odd? I'm tempted to say yes, it is odd, because 9 is odd. But I have to be careful before I say yes is odd. I have to test now something that is not odd to see if that could also work and satisfy this condition for statement 1. So let's choose something that's not odd. That still gives us something that's not an even integer. So what if I choose M to be 10? Okay, so if I take 10 and I divide 10 by 2, I get something that's not an even integer. I get 5, which is not an even integer. So that also satisfies the criteria that I divide by 2 and I get something that's not even. But now if I go back to my find, is M an odd integer? Now my answer is no. So here it was yes, and here is no. So because I have two different answers, I'm not sufficient. I cannot tell you whether M is odd because I don't know based on the information given to me. It could be, but it doesn't have to be.
So we stop in that portion. What you're answering in that part is that statement 1 in and of itself is not sufficient information.
It is not, because it could be, doesn't have to be, so I eliminate A and D. My first column.
Exactly. So we're back to the grid you can see on your screen that shows that now that you know that statement 1, is not sufficient, there are a whole host of answers that you can cross off as not being able to be answered.
Right, A and D. So I'm on the right-hand side of that diagram that you're looking at where A and D are not possible answers. So if I had to make a guess at this point, I would not guess A or D. I would guess B, C, or E. So you have a greater chance of guessing versus guessing between 5 choices, guessing between 3 choices. Because I know statement 1 is not going to be enough. Okay, I can't tell you if it's sufficient or not just with that first statement.
Okay, got it.
Okay, so now if I look now at statement 2, okay, moving on to another page. Statement 2 says that m minus 3 is an even integer. Okay, so I'm going to use our even odd rules for addition subtraction. So I know that for even and odd, these are some rules you need to know. When I add an odd and an odd or subtract an odd and an odd, what do I get? Well, think about a number like 3, for example. 3 plus 3 gives me 6, so that gives me something that's even. If I add an odd and an even or subtract an odd and an even, I get something that's odd. And if I have 2 evens, I get something that's even. Okay, so here are some rules that you just need to know for your even odd problems on the GMAT. So in this case, I'm subtracting 3 from m, and I'm getting something that's even, which means I'm going to eliminate this second choice here because that equals something that's odd. So here's something that's even, and here's something that's even. Okay, here's a difference that's even, and here's a difference that's even, which means I eliminate the second option. Okay, but then I'm also told that I'm subtracting 3 from m, and 3 is what kind of number? 3 is an odd number. So when I come back to my rules, I can get rid of this third rule now because I'm not going to subtract an even, I'm subtracting an odd, which means rule number 1, okay, is the rule that I'm looking at. I've narrowed down 3 rules, 3 different options to just one option, which means m has to be odd because an odd minus odd is how I get an even number. Okay, so is m odd is the question. That was our question we were trying to figure out. Is m odd? And now we can say 100% yes, it is odd. So that statement is sufficient. Okay, so I had B, C, and E left over. I choose B and I'm done with the question. I don't need to look at C or E at this point.
Because as you have back on the screen, you're looking back at that grid. When it says is statement 2 sufficient and you say yes, you cannot have to worry about C or E.
Exactly.
If the answer was no in that case, you'd need to eliminate that and try to figure out if the other 2 were sufficient.
Exactly.
Okay, fabulous.
Right.
So as you can see here, as you can see here, the detail that's on there is sort of going to be able to clarify for you. One of the questions that comes through is the number 0 is considered even or odd.
0 is considered even. Okay, definition of even is you can divide it by 2 with nothing remaining. And so 0 divided by 2 equals 0, which means it's an even number.
Fabulous.
So anything that ends with a 0, 2, 4, 6, or 8 is even. If it ends with a 1, 3, 5, 7, 9 is odd.
Great, so we're going to move on to the next question. This question is going to be question number DS98. Is RST equal to 1? The information you are given is that statement 1, RS equals 1, and 2, ST equals 1. This is testing integers and fractions, and it's a mid-500 level question.
All right, great. So in this question, we're not given anything. Okay, so nothing there, right? There's nothing given to us. We just have a question, and the question is R times S times T equal to 1? Okay, so we set up our A, D, B, C, E, and we're ready to look at statement 1. So statement 1 tells us that R times S equals 1. Okay, so we want to know if R times S times T equals 1, but we're just told R times S equals 1. So T could be anything. T could be 50, it could be 100, it could be negative 25, it could be anything, you know. So we don't have enough without knowing anything about T for statement 1. Okay, so not enough, we eliminate A and D. Okay, nothing here about T. Nothing about T, which means this statement is going to be insufficient, not sufficient. So move on to statement 2. Ignoring statement 1, looking at 2 by itself, which says that S times T equals 1. So S times T equals 1, but what about R? R could be anything. R could be 50, 100, negative 25. It could be anything, right? So there's nothing here about R, which means this is going to be insufficient, not sufficient, which means B is also out. Okay? So now at this point, only this point, do we consider both statements together. We look at statement 1 and statement 2 together to determine if together we can answer our question. So if we look at both statements together, R times S is 1, S times T is 1, so R times S times T, is that equal to 1? So a lot of people will say yes, it is, because R and S is 1, S and T is 1, so they must all most probably give us 1. But keep in mind that we had no given information, which means that we could be working with decimals or fractions here. So is there a way to multiply two numbers to get 1 without them both equaling 1? Yes, there is. We could have R being 4 and S being 1/4, because 4 times 1/4 equals 1. So you may assume that individually they must all be 1, right, to equal 1, but they don't have to be integers in this problem. This problem did not say that R, S, and T are integers. So because it didn't say that, we can assume that. We have to also consider they could be fractions or decimals. So if R and S is if R is 4 and S is 1/4, because R times S will be 1 in that case, so that satisfies statement 1. Then S times T is 1, so if S is 1/4, then T could be 4 as well. So if we multiply R times S times T in this situation, we certainly do not get 1 as our answer. We get 4 as our answer. So again, we don't know. It could be that R, S, and T are all equal to 1, in which case, yes, it equals 1. Or it could be that R is something like 4, S is something like 1/4, and T is something like 4, in which case we do not get 1. So because we have a case where, yes, it could be 1, and we have a case that no, it doesn't have to be 1, we eliminate C, and our answer here is going to be E. We don't know. We don't have it from even together, combining the two statements together, we still can't tell if we have enough, if we're sufficient or not. We still can't answer our question, so we have to choose E. We don't know.
Fabulous. And so this takes you through the idea and conceptually of the integers and whole numbers. And you started off pretty quickly in being able to know a really important point, which was that there's nothing given.
Right.
So when there is nothing given, is there a certain way you suggest that people approach the problem?
Yes. So some people will spend a lot of time on these two statements, but when you're given 3 variables as your question, R times S times T, is that equal to 1? But in the statement, you only have information about 2 of them. Then the third one could be anything, which means automatically you don't have enough information because you don't have anything given to you about that third variable. So statement 1 and 2 by themselves, literally 5 seconds for you to say not sufficient, because you don't have anything about the third variable. The third variable is not a part of either statement, so we can't deduce anything about it. It could be anything. So that was pretty easy. Now, taking them both together is really the meat of the problem. When we look at them both together, again, you have to remember you can't make any assumptions. Most people choose C for this answer, and they get it wrong. They choose C because they assume that these are all integers. But again, we can't make that assumption because that was not given to us. So we don't make that assumption. We also consider fractions and decimals. We realize that R, S, T could be fractions, which means that it does not have to equal 1. But if we were just considering integers and not fractions or decimals, then we would assume that, yes, it has to equal 1, and we would have chosen C as our answer. And that's really the trap answer for this question. Most people choose that, which is why it got the level of difficulty that it did.
So the question is it rare for the answer to be E? Like, how often should you assume that neither piece of information is sufficient?
So is it rare? You know what? I did a little study because I get that question quite a bit. And what I found when I was looking at the questions in this book, there's 174 DS questions in this textbook. And of the 174, 16% came out to be E. Okay? So is that significant? Probably not, right? That's just kind of just the way the problems they picked for this book happened that way. You could have a test where half your answers are E. Who knows? It's completely random. So I would not sort of make any sort of assumptions or anything, theories about which letter comes up more often. I think it's just complete chance. And if you pick a letter of the day, then you could end up picking the wrong letter of the day because your test could be heavy E, or it could be heavy A, or heavy C, or who knows. But based on the 174 questions in this book, there were 16% that came up E, or 27 that came up E of the 174. So, kind of use that, take it as a grain of salt.
Okay. I'm going to let us go through one more data sufficiency because I do want to make sure I leave at least the last 15 minutes to talk through the portions on the verbal section. But again, you'll have all of the slides there. So I'm going to move us to question number 3, or do you want to do a later question? Do you want to do a more
Um,
difficult?
You pick.
All right, so we're going to go to question number 4, actually.
Okay.
So question number 4 on here is DS 154, okay? And this is a report consisting of 2,600 words is divided into 23 paragraphs. A 2-paragraph preface is then added to the report. Is the average, arithmetic mean, number of words per paragraph for all 25 paragraphs less than 120? Statement 1, each paragraph of the preface has more than 100 words. Statement 2, each paragraph of the preface has fewer than 150 words. This tests your averages and manipulating inequalities. And this is a high 600s problem.
All right, perfect. So DS 154, we got to first figure out what are we given. What's our given information? So we see that the first number they're telling us is that we have 2,600 words in our report, and this is divided into 23 paragraphs. Okay? Then they tell us that we are adding 2 additional paragraphs. So 2 more paragraphs. We're adding, we don't know how many words. They don't tell us. So that's what we're going to call X. The number of words we're adding for 2 paragraphs. Okay? And so in total, we have 25 paragraphs, including that 2-paragraph preface. And then we have 2,600 plus X words. Okay? So this first sort of column here is the words, and the second is the paragraphs. All right? So in total, we have 25 paragraphs, and we have 2,600 plus X. And X, again, represents the number of words in that 2-paragraph preface. And we want to know is the average number of words per paragraph. So our number of words is 2,600 plus X over the number of paragraphs. Is this number less than 120? Okay, there's our question. And this is a yes it is or no it's not. Yes or no question. So we're trying to figure this out. Is this 2,600 plus X divided by 25 less than 120? Okay? Yes or no? So before we look at our statement, this is why this is a great question to illustrate. Before we jump to statement 1, we got some cleaning up to do. Okay? This is not the most straightforward way to represent this find. We want to spend some time rearranging this inequality such that it's easier to look at. We want to essentially solve the inequality for X so that when we get to our 2 statements, it's a little bit more obvious what to do with the information we're given in the 2 statements. So if we were to rearrange the information in the find here and solve this for X, what would we get? Okay, so we have to multiply both sides by 25. All right, if we do that, what do we get? What's the math? What's 120 times 25? Let's do that really quickly. Okay, we got a 0, got a 10, got a 6, and then we have another 0, a 4, and a 2. So that should give us 3,000. If I did that math right, 120 times 25 is 3,000. So I have 2,600. I'm going to move on to the next page here. I have 2,600 plus X is less than 3,000. 2,600 plus X is less than 3,000. So now when I subtract the 2,600 on both sides, I have X is less than 400. So this is now my question. This is now my find. So I have kind of simplified the average equation into is X less than 400. It's so much easier to look at the statements this way versus looking at the statements with the numerator denominator less than 150.
So
right?
before you go on, the question that came in is, how did you know that you needed to simplify that problem?
That is something that I do for every single problem when I can. So it just so happens that the 2 examples we did before, one example didn't have any given information, so it was absolutely nothing to simplify. And the other one just said M is an integer, right? Mm-hmm. If they had given us more of a word problem type of format, I certainly would have asked myself, can I simplify this?
Okay.
So it's a question that you're always asking yourself before you jump to statement 1 is, can you do some simplification? Can you rearrange some things? Can you rewrite it? Can you draw a picture or a table or a diagram? Can you get the information that's given to you in a more simplistic manner than how it was framed in the question? Spend the time there so that when you get to the statements, they become way obvious, more so than if you had not spent the time up front. Okay, so we have our A, D, B, C, E, and now we're ready for statement 1. And now we're going to see how easy it is to analyze this question with this format versus the format that was originally positioned to us. So if we look at statement 1, it says each paragraph has more than 150 words. So that tells us 100 words. That tells us that X is more than what? 100 or 200? We have to remember our X represented both paragraphs, right? And this says that each paragraph had more than 100, which means both had more than 200, right? So X is more than 200, okay? Because X represents the number of words for both of the for the total of the two paragraphs. So we're trying to figure out is X less than 400. Statement 1 says it's greater than 200, which means it could be 201 or it could be a million. We don't know how much greater than 200 is, which means we cannot say for sure it's less than 400. So we eliminate A and D. Okay, we cannot say it's less than 400. It could be, doesn't have to be, right? So we move on to statement 2. Statement 2 says that each paragraph has fewer than 150 words. So again, together they have fewer than 300 words. Okay, so X represented both together. So together they're fewer than 300. So we're trying to figure out, are we less than 400? Well, statement 2 says we're less than 300. So if we're less than 300, we're certainly going to be less than 400, which means that's enough to say yes. We are less than 400. We're sufficient. We choose B, and we're done.
Fabulous. And so I think the important thing there is that when you're looking at it, you did not need to know that X was less than 200. So you did not need to know the information in statement A. Statement 1, right, in order to be able to answer that.
In fact, when I'm looking at statement 2, I have to first look at it by itself. I never look at them together unless I've eliminated A, D, and B. Okay, so statement 2 by itself was not sufficient. At that point, only that point would I consider them both together and say, okay, together do I need both of them to determine. But in this case, I never looked at them both together because B, 2 by itself was sufficient. So I chose B and I'm done. So I don't need to look at them together for this in this case.
Fabulous. So I know that there's, like I said, there's an additional 2 questions in here for data sufficiency, and an additional question in the deck itself for problem solving. So when you have the deck, you'll be able to go through those. I'm going to move us to spend the last 15 minutes or so talking through the verbal section. Stephanie did a great job of sort of setting up what the verbal section is. She's going to talk about the types of questions and give you a little bit of conceptual information you need to know beforehand. It's difficult to sort of go through the verbal section in detail here because it's not easy to kind of work out, but we'll try to give you some tips to make this section easier. So Stephanie?
Perfect. So on this slide, you'll see there's 3 different question types for the verbal section, okay? The first one is called critical reasoning. In this question type, you're going to be asked to analyze an argument. So an argument can be anywhere from, I would say, 2 to 7 sentences, so it's a very short paragraph. And your job is to analyze the argument, the plan of action, the premises that are given to you, and answer the question. Okay, and it's only one question for each of these. So it's not like, multiple questions per paragraph. It's just a single question that's on the screen at the time that you're reading the paragraph. So my advice is to always read the question first, and then read the paragraph and answer that paragraph. The second question type you'll see is the sentence correction. And that question type presents you with a sentence. So the sentence could be, a very short sentence, it could be a very long sentence. And then within that sentence is an underlined portion. And so your job is to analyze that underlined portion to determine if there's any grammatical mistakes in that underlined portion. If there's not, you choose A. A is always just a replicate of the original sentence. And if so, you choose one of the other 4 choices, B, C, D, or E, and figure out how to correct the errors presented in the sentence. The third type of question is the reading comprehension question type. So this question type, you're presented with a passage. The passage could be, 1 paragraph. It could be 5 paragraphs. So you want to make sure that you use your scroll bar on your screen to scroll down and see the entire passage will remain on the screen, on the left-hand side of the screen. And then one at a time, you'll see the questions, okay? So you will not see all the questions ahead of time. You will see them one at a time. So you won't know how many questions you have with that particular passage. You could have 3, you could have 6. You don't really know until you get to the end of it. But the passage will stay on your screen at all times, and you're answering the questions based on what you've read in the passage, okay? So those are the 3 different question types you're going to see. There are 41 questions in total in the verbal section. You'll see there's approximately 13 or 14 reading comprehension. There's 12 critical reasoning, and there are 16 sentence completion, 15 or 16 sentence completion questions, for a total of 41 questions in 75 minutes. So that is roughly 1 minute and 48 seconds per question, including the time it takes to read the passage. So that's not a lot of time. So again, timing is really, really important on this test. You want to practice not just for accuracy, but also you want to practice with the constraint of time so that when you get into your real GMAT, you know how much time it takes you to do certain things. There are some questions that take you more time, and there's going to be some that take you less time. So keep that in mind. You're averaging out to be about 1 minute, 48 seconds per question, but you can spend more time on some and less time on others. And just like the quant section, the first problem you see will be that 500 level mid-range problem, and then you'll progress in difficulty level, assuming you're getting those questions correctly. And then you can do the opposite and get easier questions if you're not getting them correct. So you're kind of juggling throughout the test, bouncing back and forth until the test narrows down and hones in on the level that you are. So on the next slide, this is getting into the critical reasoning question type. So there's 8 different categories of questions here. So when I say read the question first, you want to read the question and figure out which category it falls into. Okay, is it a strengthening question? Is it a weakening question? Is it an evaluation question? Is it an inference question, assumption question, explanation, fallacy, or main idea? So those are 8 different categories. Those common, I should say, categories that you're going to see on the GMAT. Definitely the most common will be the strength and weaken, and the other ones are you'll see quite a few of those as well, but you'll see more of the strength and weaken questions than anything else on this part of the test. And then also on this slide is a general approach. Okay, how do you approach this type of question? The first thing you want to do is, of course, read the question. Okay, not the paragraph, but read the question first so you can identify the category it falls into. You want to understand what's being asked of you and the type of question that it is. You also, then you want to read the short argument. Okay, it's going to be pretty short, anywhere from 2 to 7 sentences. You want to read it with the question in mind as you're reading it so that you are focusing in on what you're being asked to do. Okay, so if you're asked to strengthen it, as you're reading it, think about things that will strengthen it. If you're asked to weaken it, as you're reading the paragraph, think about things that will weaken it. If you're asked to find any assumptions, think about that as you read through the passage. So I think it's clear. It kind of helps you to frame yourself better if you have in mind what you're asked to do versus not having that in mind. If you need to, take some notes as you're reading it. Sometimes it's helpful to jot down some quick notes. That's going to be really, really important with the reading comprehension section, but it could be, for some people, could be very helpful with this part as well. And then look for any facts, what is not stated but explicitly, but you can assume it to be true. Look for anything that's not substantiated, any claims that are made that don't have any sort of backbone or some gaps in there. Look for things that kind of are puzzling or kind of leave you wondering or wanting to dig deeper. And then make sure you read all the answer choices. Okay, you can read A and think, oh, A is the best choice, but make sure you read B, C, D, and E before you go back and say A is the best choice. So sometimes there's, maybe 2 choices that both sound great. You have to choose the best answer. And the best answer means that the entire answer choice has to be correct. If one word is incorrect, you have to eliminate the entire answer choice. You can't get bogged down on answer choice. If there's one thing about it that doesn't work, you have to let it go. And that's hard to do because but everything else is so great about it. If there's one word, if the word only or always or never, those strong words come up in the answer choice that make it incorrect, you have to let it go and move on to the one that is the correct answer. So that's really, really important that you do that. So
So there are 2 questions that are in this section. I'm going to have you pick one of the 2 of them. And while you're looking to figure out which one to pick, I got a great question. If for individuals who are non-English native speaking, this entire part can be very difficult to sort of understand. Are there any books or portions or things that you would recommend that people read or practice with beforehand? Because much of this is kind of understanding it as a native speaker.
What I recommend you do, if you're kind of worried about this part of the test, is over Thanksgiving dinner, I want you to choose a topic. Okay, it can be political, it can be anything you want it to be. I want you to have a debate with your in-laws or your, extended family, your close family. I want you to have a debate, because what you're doing when you debate an issue is you're strengthening, you're weakening, you're finding assumptions, you're finding flaws in the arguments. That's what you're doing when you have a debate with someone about a different topic. So that's the best way to study for this part of the test, is to choose a topic where, maybe you're a Democrat and, your brother's a Republican, or maybe, you say black and somebody else says green, or it doesn't matter what it is, but if you can support what you're saying and find flaws in what the other person's saying, you are studying for this part of the test.
Fabulous.
Okay? Also, if you have any friends that are lawyers, this is all day LSAT stuff. Lawyers do this kind of stuff all the time. So if you have friends or family that are attorneys, you can certainly sit down with them and start a debate with them, and they will help you easily to see how to, poke holes in different things. And so I think that this is actually part of the test. Most people find it fun because it is something that, you enjoy sort of doing in your free time, even though you don't know you're doing it. If you have a spouse, I'm sure you do it all the time. And
whether you knew it or not, you're studying when you had that
yes,
argument. All right, so which one?
So let's go with the second one.
All right, so we're doing the second question. You have it up on the screen. It's CR 83. Many people suffer an allergic reaction to certain sulfites, including those that are commonly added to wine as preservatives. However, since there are several winemakers who add sulfites to none of the wines they produce, people who would like to drink wine but are allergic to sulfites can drink wine produced by these winemakers without risking an allergic reaction to sulfate. Which of the following is an assumption on which the argument depends? And you see the 5 answers below.
So if we were tackling this question on the GMAT, we would first read the question. So the question is asking which of the following is an assumption on which the argument depends. And based on our 8 categories, this falls to the assumption category. So when we read the paragraph, we're reading it within our minds. We're thinking about what assumptions are they making here they're not explicitly telling us. What are some things that they're kind of jumping from 1 to 3 or from A to C, and they're skipping over B. So what's the B? What's the middle thing that has to connect everything together in order for this to hold true? What's the glue that keeps the conclusion to be valuable? So when we read this, it says that we have people who are suffering from an allergic reaction to sulfites, which is commonly added as a preservative to different types of wine. It says, however, there are several winemakers who don't add sulfites. So they say add sulfites to none, which means they do not add sulfites to their wine. Okay, so it's saying people who would like to drink this wine but who are allergic to sulfites can do so without risking an allergic reaction. So when you think about, before you read your answer choices, it's important to think about what is the assumption that's being made before you get tempted by the choices. So think about what are they assuming here? They're saying that I can drink this wine and not have an allergic reaction because they did not add sulfites to it. But what if there's sulfites already in there, right? How is it that I can still have a reaction with them not adding sulfites to the wine, right? If there's already sulfites in the wine, just because maybe it appears in the grapes, or maybe it's part of the fermentation process, or somehow it's just already in the wine, even though it's nothing being added to the wine, there could be something that's already added. Kind of like when they say something says no sugar added, but there's still sugar in there, right? You see all that all the time on different packages, no sugar added. That doesn't mean it's sugar free. It just means that there's none added. Okay, but apples have lots of sugar in them, but there's nothing added. You don't have to add it to the apple. So is there sulfites already in the wine? If there are sulfites naturally occurring in the wine, then I can still have an allergic reaction. But if there's not, then I don't have the reaction. So what the assumption here is, if I drink this wine, I won't have the reaction because there's none being added, and there's also none occurring naturally in the wine already. So when I look at these 5 choices, I'm looking at them with already in my head of what I'm looking for. I've already kind of determined the assumption that's being made is that there's absolutely no sulfites, which means there weren't any naturally occurring already. So you always want to, before you read the choices, think about how you respond to the question. And then that way you're not tempted by answer choices that may kind of sound good to you, but it's not what you had thought of beforehand. If you find what you thought of beforehand, then you're golden, okay? Because that is going to be the right answer. But if you're tempted by some things that sound right, because a lot of things sound right but are wrong, and because that happens, you really want to have something in your head before you get to these choices. If you read these 5 choices, the choice that we're looking for that says that nothing was already added or nothing naturally occurring in the wine is choice E. It says sulfites are not naturally present in the wines produced by these winemakers in amounts large enough to produce an allergic reaction in someone who drinks these wines. So basically what it's saying is that what we said before, we can drink the wine knowing that nothing was added, and also knowing that nothing high enough naturally occurring is gonna cause an allergic reaction. So that's how we approach these question types. You want to first read the question, then you want to read the paragraph. Think about how you respond to the question first, then go through the 5 answer choices, eliminating 4 before you choose the best choice.
Right. So in this case, what you're really wanting folks to understand is that reading the question responses without knowing what you're looking for is a bad situation.
It can really, especially with the difficult questions, it can really lead you down a path that you don't want to go down. So it's always helpful to think about the response first, so that you're not going through the 5 choices saying, oh, that sounds good, oh, that sounds good, oh, that sounds good. There may be 1 or 2 that obviously are wrong, but you may get stuck on 2 or 3 if you haven't first thought about what you're looking for.
That makes sense. So we're going to move on to the next type of questions, which are sentence correction strategies. And Stephanie's got a couple here on the screen to explain to you how you should go about it. So
great. So this part of the test is all about knowing your grammar rules. Okay, so I've listed here the top grammar rules that are tested on the GMAT. The most common being the subject-verb agreement. You have to make sure a subject and verb agree. If they don't agree, then that's your error. Okay, so the first thing you want to look for is the subject, look for the verb, make sure they match. When I say match, I mean make sure they're both singular, make sure they're both plural. Okay?
And again, this is a non-native speaking issue as well. So something
right.
that the more you practice, what would you say is put into practice?
I would say you first make sure you understand these rules very, very well. So you can pick up a grammar review book and look up these rules. I'm sure there's tons of different resources on the internet that you can kind of brush up on your different grammar rules. But you should know what parallel means, what misplaced modifier is, what an adjective and an adverb are. You should know what a subject is and a verb, and idioms. All these different terms are things that you should know what they are, but more importantly, you should know how to identify them in a sentence. Okay, so not just what they are, but when you look at a sentence, you should be able to recognize when something is not used correctly, so that way you can get down to the correct answer. So when you think about the approach to this type of question, the key here is to read the sentence first very carefully, and again, think before, are there any errors? Is there anything incorrect that you can see in the original sentence? Think about that before you get tempted by those answer choices. And then when you get to the choices, you want to sort of analyze them comparatively. So consider all 5 choices. The first choice is always going to be a repeat of the original sentence, so that one's not going to change. But the other 4 choices are going to be variations of the original sentence, okay? So you really want to look at those 5 choices and sort of scan them all to see how they're different. You're going to notice some differences right away. Differences in verbs. Some verbs are going to be plural, some are going to be singular. So then your question should be, okay, which one is correct? Should it be singular or plural? Go back to the sentence, find the subject, see if the subject is singular. If so, make sure you eliminate the choices that have plural verbs. If the subject is plural, eliminate the sentences that have singular verbs. So that's always a great place to start, because usually you can eliminate 1 or 2 choices just based off subject-verb agreement automatically. And then the other 3 choices you can eliminate based on something else. Most of these sentences have more than 1 error. And so it's not just going to be one thing wrong with it. It's going to be multiple things wrong with it. So you can eliminate based on one thing, and then based on what you have left, kind of keep narrowing it down until you have 1 that's left over.
Fabulous.
Okay.
So which one would you want to? And this is the list that's on the screen that you see of your approach. Definitely digest this as a way to look at each one of those problems. Stephanie, which one would you want to do? Question 1 or 2 to walk them through a sentence correction.
Let's see. Let's go with.
And as she's looking for that, this will be our last question of note. I recognize we're a little bit over. I thank you guys for hanging on with us. The hard part about the last section, which is reading comprehension, is it's very difficult to sort of explain how to do a reading comprehension portion. Stephanie put some great notes in here, but doing a problem on that is a little bit challenging. So in this regard, we're going to answer this last question and then make sure we have some next steps for you to take away from here. So.
Okay, great. So let's go with the second one, the 140, sentence completion 140.
All right. So rock samples taken from the remains of an asteroid about twice the size of a 6-mile-wide asteroid that eradicated the dinosaurs has been dated to be 3.4 billion years old, and thus is evidence of the earliest known asteroid impact on Earth. As she noted, your first question A is a restatement of the same, and then you have B through E below. So Stephanie, how would you have them approach?
Okay, great. So this one has, the underlined portion has been dated to be 3.47 billion years old, and thus is. So the first word that's underlined is has been. That's a verb. So again, like I said earlier, we want to look for subject and verb, make sure they agree. So what is the subject of the sentence? If you go back to the sentence, the subject is samples. Okay, all the other stuff in between the subject and verb is just your extra information, your kind of flowery information that is not the subject and is not the verb, it's just additional information. So rock samples, blah, 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 have been dated. Samples is plural, so you need a plural verb to match that. So A and B both have singular verbs. Has been is singular. That's not what we're looking for to match with the verb, with the subject samples. So based on that and that alone, we can get rid of those two choices, A and B. So we're looking at C, D, and E, which all have the correct verb, have been, have been, have been. So we can scan those three to see how else they're different from each other. So if we look at the last words of those three choices, the first one, C and E, have are, and D ends with thus. So R is a verb, so it ends with a verb, whereas D does not end with a verb. If you go back to the original sentence, we need a verb there because we're saying that samples have been dated and they are evidence. Okay, so this is sort of a compound that have been dated and they are evidence. So we need the are there to go with the evidence. They are evidence. Okay, so therefore choice D doesn't work because it doesn't end with the verb. All right, so we got rid of A and B based on the initial verb. We got rid of choice D based on the ending verb. Okay, so we're left between C and E at this point. And we scan C and E. C has the article to be, and E has the article at. Or these are idioms. Okay, so which idiom is correct? Should it be have been dated to be or have been dated at? Okay, and the idioms can be very, very tricky. There's so many idioms in our English language that it's impossible to sort of memorize and learn all of them. But on the GMAT and most standardized exams, the passive voice of idioms to be is never going to be correct. Okay, it's first of all it's wordier than just saying at, and second of all it makes the idiom passive versus making it active. So whenever you see sort of to be and you see in the choice D, you see the being. Making the verbs with the ing is making it a passive versus an active verb. So we want to get rid of anything that has to be or has being for those reasons. So therefore we can eliminate choice C, and then our final answer is E. So what we've done here is we've compared all 5 choices. We've scanned them all to see how they're different, and we've eliminated down till we get to one final answer. And that's what you want to do for these sentence correction questions is look at them all, figure out how they're similar, how they're different, and keep eliminating one at a time until you end up with one that remains, and the one that remains is going to be your correct answer.
So I think this is really important, and as we wrap up, I just want to make sure you note, everybody sort of looks at the GMAT as a mathematical or an analytical test, and it is that. But there are a lot of portions where the verbal section can add to your overall score, and just that you should note how that portion of that works. And so Stephanie has some really great takeaways here that if you just sort of kind of commit to the strategies for these sections, it will make those portions go faster and pretty much give you a really great kind of boost in how you're looking at it. So for these slides, and like I said, we're going to email these slides to you in totality. Just make sure you think through those strategies. Just the portion of making sure you don't read the answer choices before you know what you want to get for a portion. Or as you're looking at it, you start with things like subject-verb agreement. All of those little tips will help to make it go faster because, as she mentioned, you've got about 1:48 for these. And so it's not very long to digest it. So give them ample time by putting yourself ahead in terms of strategy. The last portion that's on here that we're not going to get to today is the reading comprehension. And so I know that that a lot of you have questions about that. Reading comprehension is very difficult to sort of break down, but Stephanie put some very good points in here. What I wanted to make sure we did get a chance to talk about for the last 2-3 minutes we have on here is creating a study plan really quickly, so she can talk through that. And then for all of you who've been responding and you now understand how rock star Stephanie is, because she is pretty rock star, which is why we try to keep her around, I'll include Stephanie's information here so that you can look to her to figure out how to get more training. Because her company does do tutoring in a number of places in and around the Atlanta area, and this is the kind of stuff where that one-on-one assistance and really getting tutoring help can pay enormous dividends. So I tell people all the time, this test is really important. It's not just for when you get into a program, but how you should approach a business school process as a whole. thinking about how to analytically approach problems and break things down will help you in the classroom and well beyond. So it is an investment up front that I think pays infinite dividends and will be able to help you along the way. So we're going to talk about creating a plan, a study strategy, and then I'm going to email out these slides plus this video link probably in the next 4 or 5 days for those of you who are trying to make sure you get this portion ready as you get ready to study for your test. And then we'll go through sort of next steps. So this is the detail up here for sort of creating that plan, and then we'll go to wrap up in next steps.
Okay, great. So as Angela said, this is an investment, okay? And if you sign up for some tutoring or test prep classes, it's an investment not just with your money, but it's a huge investment with your time. Studying for the GMAT can take, some people a year, okay? If they're trying to get a really competitive score to get those scholarships and make sure they get into Goizueta and other schools, you certainly want to have the highest score you can possibly get, and that's going to take some time. So some people, like I said, study up to a year. They take it 3 or 4 times. Other people can study for a few months and take it, 3 or 4 times. It just really depends upon, what you have going on in your personal life. So what I recommend is that you start early. This is not the kind of test you want to wait until the last minute and just say, oh, I just go and I'll just take it and see how I do. Okay, hopefully you saw today that, you want to make sure that you understand the strategies and make sure you understand some time-saving tips. You want to practice not only from the book, the official guide GMAT book, but also you want to practice from the online practice software, because it is a computer-based test. So you want to make sure you have enough practice on the computer screen and not just in your textbook. So you'll see here where it says do something every day. There's a website here, mba.com, where you can go to download the GMAT prep software, and that's also a great starting point for a lot of people who have never seen the GMAT content before. You want to just go take a practice test for free, just to see what it's all about and see how you're doing, just kind of raw code without any prep, and that will help you determine how much time and how much assistance you need to get you ready for the GMAT. So if you take a practice test today, for example, and you score 650, 700, great. It means that you're almost to the point where you need to be. Maybe with a few additional points you can get some scholarships. Maybe you'll study for another month before taking your test. But if you take the practice test today and you score in the 400s, for example, that tells you need to make sure you dedicate some time, anywhere from 1 to 3 months all the way up to who knows how much time you have, but make sure you spend some really good dedicated times preparing for this test so that you can go from a 400 to what your target score is. So keep that in mind. If you look at going back to the first point, 3 to 6 months is pretty standard for most people. Some people take more time, some people take less time. It really depends on how you schedule your time, how much time you have outside of work, outside of family, etc. If you have holidays are coming up, if you're going on family vacation for Thanksgiving, then I wouldn't, say you're going to dedicate 3 or 4 hours a day to studying if you're going to be, with family and friends and all that. So make sure when you set sort of goals for yourself, that you set them to be realistic and not, not something that's not attainable. Because what happens when you make a plan and you don't make those plans realistic is that plan soon becomes waste. And it's going to end up in the trash, and that's not a good place to be, because then you'll have to kind of start all over again. So keep that in mind. Be realistic. Like I said, schedule around different things. When you're studying, make sure you study in a real testing environment. So when you take the real GMAT, you're not allowed anything in the room with you except for what they give you to take in the room, which is something to write on, something to write with. You're not allowed to bring in any water or coffee or a cell phone or laptop or Facebook and Twitter and all these different things. All you're allowed is what they give you and nothing more. So when you're studying and you're taking these practice exams, the best thing to do is to treat that as if it's the real test, and make sure you don't have any distractions around, or beverages or anything around that can take away from your testing environment. And then, like I said, write down your plan, stick to it. Make sure that you're setting your goals and making sure they're realistic. You want to go ahead and choose your test date so that you're working towards that date. Okay, if you don't have a test date in mind, then it's kind of like you don't know when the finish line is going to come. So you can drag it out, you lose momentum, etc. You kind of take days off, and then when you get back into it, you're not as sharp as you once were. So really go ahead and set the date. Okay, say you're going to take the GMAT January, March, April, whenever, and then work towards that date, writing down everything you plan to do from today is day one up until your GMAT date such that you have your plan in place, and your plan should really include working through this official guide GMAT book by the GMAC, this 13th edition book, as well as making sure you take enough online practice tests. If you go to the next screen, you'll see here that there's a table, there's a calendar here with sort of a suggested study plan. And you'll notice that it's going to say Green Book. When I say Green Book, I really mean this this second edition official guidebook that's just the quantitative section only. So if you need more practice problems to work through, you work through all the ones in the blue book, and so now you want more. This is a supplementary book you can purchase to help you, help give you more sort of guided problems to use to study from. So I always tell people it's not the quantity of materials you have to study with, it's really the quality, how you're spending your time. Repetition is really, really important. Doing a problem one time, and spending 5 minutes on it is not enough. Obviously, 5 minutes is too much time for one problem. So doing that problem 2 or 3 times until you can condense it and answer it, within that 2-minute time frame that you have is what you want to be working towards. So that's going to take, for some people, 2 or 3 times looking at one problem to feel comfortable with it enough that you can answer it correctly in the time frame that you're allotted on the test. So that being said, your goal is not to go out and buy 4 or 5 different GMAT books that you see in Barnes and Noble, but rather to get just a few books, 1 or 2, and sit down with those books and work through those problems again and again and again until you have mastered them and can answer all of them in the 2-minute time frame, 2 to 3 minute time frame. And then of course go on their website, mba.com, download that software and take those online practice tests. And you can take those practice tests several times, because every time you take those tests, you're going to see different questions because it's adapting to how you're performing. So if you're performing better than you did before, you should certainly see different questions, harder level questions than you did when you took the test a previous time. So that's really what I recommend in terms of studying for this test. I think the last thing I'll say is, if you're kind of an on-the-go kind of person, I do have a Facebook, Twitter page where you can go and do practice math questions on those pages. It's also a great way to sort of interact with other people who are also studying for the test, and there's little competitions and things going on the pages, so that way it can be a little bit more fun to do. So definitely join the Math SP Facebook, Twitter pages, and LinkedIn as well. And then, make sure you kind of do something every single day. This is the kind of test where it's kind of like working out. You don't go to the gym and work out for 4 or 5 hours in one day, but rather you do 30 minutes here and 30 minutes there, an hour here, an hour there, to kind of get you in shape versus kind of trying to do it all at one time. You're going to burn out really quickly if you're trying to do it all at one time versus kind of breaking it up and doing a little bit every day. So make your plan realistic and do something every single day to reach your goal, your ultimate goal of getting that top tier GMAT score that will help you not only get into business school, but help you with the scholarships and help you with your post-MBA job opportunities as well.
Great. I don't know about you guys. I don't have to take the GMAT again. I'm done with that phase of my life. But I think this is really, really helpful. I know there were some great questions in here. We got all your questions. If you weren't answered on here, let us know. Send an email to us afterwards. We can make sure we address it later. You will have a copy of the slides along with the full roughly 90-minute or so, 90 to maybe close to 2 hours, link to this video for you to go back and be able to refresh yourself in the process. But please listen to what Stephanie's saying in terms of a plan. Getting the books and being able to sort of scope this out as you're thinking about doing it so that it works best. What you have up on the screen and have had on the screen and will have in the deck is Stephanie's contact information. I highly recommend, if you've got a more challenging timetable than what most people are looking at in order to try to get this test taken for your application dates, which typically are falling in this kind of now fall through very, very early winter timetable, you're probably going to need more than you can do on your own. So considering tutoring, considering some help in that area would be really great. And I know Stephanie will be happy to point you towards others in other areas if you're not here locally to be able to give you some advice. So I thank you guys for staying around with us. I know we ran over. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you, Stephanie, for your time. I know that this was really very awesome in our studio of two. And we hope this was helpful for you. Look out for an email from us probably the beginning part of next week, and have a great rest of your day.